Well, welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you joined us today. And we are going to be focusing on chapter 10, which is a really good chapter. It moves into some fun stuff in the Daodejing. Let me go ahead and bring up my slides here. Perfect. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to read through the chapter first. It's a little bit longer than the ones that we've been reading in the past, but well, we'll just get into it and you can kind of see how it unfolds. Can you balance your life force and embrace the one without separation? Can you control your breath gently like a baby? Can you clarify your dark vision without blemish? Can you love people and govern the country without knowledge? Can you open and close the gate of heaven without clinging to earth? Can you brighten the four directions without action? Give birth and cultivate. Give birth and do not possess. Act without dependence. Excel but do not rule. This is called dark da. I know it looks like T or te, but it's pronounced da. And this is the same da as in the Daodejing. So they, in this translation that we've been using, Addiss and Lombardo, they do not translate Dao or da. And we'll spend some time explaining what da is, as well as the rest of this chapter. But we're probably going to have to take a couple of different episodes to get through this whole thing because there's a lot here. The key thing I want to kind of bring up is that this chapter is focusing with this issue of trying to exist in two different worlds. And so it keeps bringing up the refrain, can you? And we're going to see how this kind of plays out. But remember, Taoism is presenting a particular way of being, a Tao, same as Confucius and others, that is obviously not the same as what people are currently experiencing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be something on offer. It'd just be the way things were. And so if we find ourselves, let's say in our context, we're in 21st century Western America that has a very specific, well, some of us are in America, a few of us are in Canada today on the call. There is definitely a mindset that pervades everything that we exist in. We definitely have a strong sense of individuality and autonomy that is key, that was very different from the context in which the Daodejing arises. And so if we were trying to implement some of these aspects of Taoism into our life today, then part of the challenge is, can you do this while existing in, your current world context? And that's kind of what's happening with a number of these questions that come up in this chapter today. But they're also focusing on this idea of self-cultivation. So we've, in the first 9 chapters, really dealt with kind of shifting way of looking at the world, looking at challenging the question of values and how those play a role, and thinking about the differences in terms of socially constructed world versus the natural world, and how the Taoists would argue that we want to bring ourselves more in alignment with the natural ordering of things. And so the question is, can you do that? And part of this chapter then, in regards to that self-cultivation, is really focusing on this idea of meditation or mindfulness. So we don't know exactly all the practices, the way they did it at that time. There's definitely talk about the types of practices that they were doing, but we have to kind of reconstruct. And there's some things that seem to be pretty consistent between lots of different cultures. So we have to kind of make some assumptions. But even if we don't know exactly what the particular practices they were using, we can see what they were focusing on with this series of questions that are brought up in this chapter. So before we get into the first part of that, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what do we mean exactly by meditation or mindfulness. These are definitely concepts that are very prevalent in our world today. And I think it'll be good to just kind of review this, because I think people have a lot of different perspectives on what these might mean. And I've got my own way of looking at it as well. So this isn't meant to incorporate or encompass everything or the final word on this topic, but just to kind of give you some thoughts on how I approach it. And we can kind of see if you guys have some additional thoughts that you'd like to share. But the first and probably most important aspect of it, I think, is this idea of non-judgmental curiosity. This is at the core of any kind of meditation or mindfulness. And so already we've seen in previous chapters the question between, let's say, calling something good and evil within Taoism. They would say, these are constructs that we're bringing to it that don't naturally exist. What happens if we remove those filters so we can just see clearly what is, which is definitely one of the core Taoist goals, is to see as clearly as possible the reality of our situation. So this non-judgmental curiosity becomes really important for this idea of mindfulness and meditation. We're trying to cultivate a way of being more fully aware and present in the current circumstances. And so we're going to encounter various thoughts, we're going to encounter feelings, we're going to encounter sensations. And the key thing here is we want to be curious about all those things so that we can notice them. We don't want to be judging them as, oh, I shouldn't have had that thought, or I shouldn't have had that emotion, or why is my leg cramping, or, any of these kinds of things. We want to just take all the judgment aspects out and just stay focused on the curiosity of noticing. And that kind of brings us to the idea that we're going to be focusing attention. Now, when I do any type of mindfulness or meditation work, there's some people that will work on doing more of a guided meditation where they listen to somebody speaking through the process. I don't personally care for that myself. I prefer to kind of have more of my own self-directed, I guess you might say, mindfulness or meditation when I do it. But there's some key things that you can do to start working on some of these tools. And one of them is the practice of focusing attention. So we're not going to actually be doing meditation at this moment, but I'll just kind of list off some things that you might want to try at some point if you get some time and you're in a place where you can do that. But with focusing attention, you might just notice, if you're sitting in your room or your office or wherever you are, it doesn't have to be, in a specific meditation context. It can just be anywhere. Just notice that you can actually shift where your attention is. You can be focusing on something across the room, maybe a bookshelf over there, or you can move it closer to, let's say, the computer, if that's what's in front of you. And you're shifting that attention. Your focus can move based on where you want to put it. And that attention can be both about, presence and things around you, but it can also end up being one of deepening awareness of, what does it feel like when I'm sitting in this chair? Can I feel the texture of the chair? Can I feel, where my feet are and what that feels like? Can I, experience, one of the key meditative practices is focusing on your breath. Can I notice what that feels like as it's coming in through my nose, or as my chest or my belly is expanding, and what it feels like when it comes out? And just becoming deeper and deeper aware of exactly what's happening in the moment. What are the sounds? What are the sights? What are the feelings and sensations? And just becoming more and more aware of that has the effect of bringing you into the present moment. We tend to be stuck in our heads in either the future or the past. It's very hard for us to be just in the moment. And so this practice of focusing our attention and deepening our awareness of where we are, and doing that within the context of non-judgmental curiosity, really helps to bring us into this present moment. Our cultures are very hostile to this idea. The onslaught of visual images and constant changing of, colors and lights and sounds is really designed to kind of stir and keep that attention going and distracted, that has created a context where many of us find it hard to focus. I don't know if there's an explosion in it, but definitely it seems to be something that's talked about a lot more than I ever remember growing up. This idea of ADHD or other types of attention challenges. We have to really work at overcoming that. If we're going to actually learn anything, if we're going to be able to incorporate these aspects of wellness into our life, it's going to require that we have the ability to focus, to really dive deep into something. So taking a period of time, whether it's 5-10 minutes a day or whatever your schedule allows for. And this can happen at any point throughout the day. It doesn't have to be just, sitting quiet in the dark. You can practice any of these things to bring that mental of, when we do stuff in the brain, your neurons start to form different patterns or tracks. And the more you do something, the deeper those tracks become. And it really reshapes and rewires the brain. They call this neuroplasticity. And so the more you do something like this, it helps develop those pathways in the brain so that you have more of a focus, or the ability to focus at other times, not just when you're trying to do the mindfulness or meditation. So a lot of benefits for that process. And along with that then becomes a deepening self-regulation. We'll see that in different types of meditative practice, they'll sometimes get into breath regulation or some other process of being able to, sit still without moving, or just focusing on one thing like your breath. And all of this is going to be helping to develop this idea of self-control, the self-regulation. That's going to be very important for many things in life. But if we were going to bring it all down to kind of one statement, when we're focusing on mindfulness, the biggest challenge we have is that our mind wanders. One of the ways they talk about this, I believe it's in the Buddhist tradition, is they talk about it as monkey mind, that's constantly jumping around and switching ideas and moving around. So part of what we want to do is we want to non-judgmentally recognize when different thoughts show up or different ideas or distractions come to mind, not judge them, but just recognize that it has happened, and then gently bring ourselves back to whatever it is that we're trying to do. If it's focusing on our breath, we go back to focusing on our breath. And it's just the pattern, the patience, and the practice of doing that helps to develop those skills, where over time it becomes easier to do those various things. So this is kind of my overview of what we mean by mindfulness or meditation, but I thought I'd stop for a moment and see if you guys have any other thoughts on this that you'd like to add.
I love that they call it monkey mind.
You like that?
And I can so relate. ADHD is like one of those days where everybody's messaging you from left and right, except imagine giving all of the inanimate objects and tasks in your life the ability to message you as well. That's what it feels like.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That is like a really good description of what it feels like, Taylor. I was like, that's exactly what it is. It's just everything all the time. It's really difficult.
Very hard to shut that off.
Yeah.
How did everybody get my phone number?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, good. I encourage you to explore more about this for yourself. There's different apps out there. I know at New Rocket, we promote Headspace, but there's also Insight Timer, which I find very helpful. It gives you the ability to kind of set up some peaceful type nature sounds or music, a babbling brook or bird sounds, that kind of thing. And you can create periods of time that you want to focus on, and just doing that itself can be really helpful. But again, you can do this at any time. You can do this while you're doing the dishes or going out for a walk. The question is always, where am I? Am I right here? Or am I off in my head thinking about the future or concerned about something that might happen, or just, beating myself up about something that happened in the past? That's where we tend to live. So just like walking the dog, like, oh, what's the weather like? What's the dog doing? What are my feet up to? All those things, just become curious and become aware. And it's amazing how much all these types of activities can bring you back into the present without having to get into, a specific pose and sitting maybe in the dark or without any sound. It can be just as mindful to become as aware of many different sounds as you can at the same time too. It doesn't even have to be quiet. So, and you don't have to have your eyes closed. You can notice as many things as you can notice. Noticing the difference between the foreground and background, or, the shapes of things, or trying to experience things without giving them a name is another kind of a core practice that I like to do. So, yeah, I encourage you to just kind of play with that and explore the different things, and to keep it something that is not a chore, but just an interesting, like, curiosity type thing again. All right, so let's go back then to the first part of the text, where we have the question: can you balance your life force and embrace the one without separation? And we'll bring in one other translation of this as well. So this is the same passage from a different author here. It says, in cultivating your bodily soul to embrace the one, can you abide there undivided? And there's a lot of different ways that this has been looked at in terms of the different translations I have, but I think these both bring out some key aspects. The one is, within Chinese traditional thinking, there is they'll use the concept that we translate as soul, or sometimes as spirit, in a couple of different ways that are a bit different than how we normally do. In fact, after we get through this chapter, I might kind of just do a specific one just on the different ways they talk about this concept of soul or spirit. But in the person, they would actually see that there's two of these. There's what's called the Hun spirit, which is maybe more akin to what we think about something that persists after someone passes, but they would, maybe look at this more kind of along the lines of what we think of as like reputation or something along those lines. But then there was also a Po spirit, which was the bodily spirit, and it actually passes when the body passes. And so what's interesting in this line is it's not bringing both Hun and Po together, but it's only mentioning and specifically dealing with Po, the bodily spirit, or, maybe what we could think of part of that aspect that animates what the body is. Sometimes these concepts really overlap, because we can think about qi that's used within traditional Chinese thinking as well, that seems like it's kind of an overlap with that, and there probably is some. So there's a lot of blending of these concepts. But specifically, they're bringing up this idea then of Po, the bodily aspects. And so in the first translation, it's talking about your life force, and the second one is saying your bodily soul, to try and make that more explicit. And it's talking about, okay, you're getting a hold of this idea of, okay, my body, myself, my location where I exist here. And then it's talking about embracing the one. So the one here is getting to this larger concept that we've talked about in Taoism, that essentially everything is one thing, that there's different ways that it kind of gets manifested. And we'll kind of go back to our chart on this here in just a second. But the question is, okay, so if we recognize and experience ourselves as kind of like this location of perception is in this one place, and it's like, okay, I've got this body, I'm this thing, it can feel like I'm very independent and separate and autonomous from what's going on around me. But it's saying, well, don't forget, you've got to embrace this concept that everything is actually one thing, everything's interconnected. Can you, again with this Taoist idea, hold that? Can you bring that together without getting it separated? Can you experience that oneness without the division, without leaving or becoming divided? And this is a huge challenge. So we'll just kind of review a little bit of kind of the layout. And this is just my graphical way of kind of trying to define how it's talking about some of these core concepts. So when we're saying Tao, we're not talking about a thing per se, but more about a way of things, kind of like what we might talk about natural laws, right? Like how do things interact with each other and how do they unfold? And so Taoism as a way is concerned about that ultimate way, that higher level of thinking about the way, not a way that somebody can tell you that you have the option to follow or not follow. The Tao of the Daodejing is something that you don't have any choice to follow. It's like gravity. You can't, doesn't matter if you're aware of it or not aware of it, it's going to happen. You're going to follow it. You don't have a choice. So this is the level of way that they're concerned about. How do we understand that so that we can bring ourselves in harmony with it? But within that, and these aren't necessarily meant to be seen as separate things, but I'm just identifying them with different colors so we can kind of piece how they kind of fit together. So absence, or another way we could talk about that, is without form. And sometimes it's almost kind of parallel, talked about it as qi. So that qi is pronounced qi, and absence is the Chinese word for, is the translation of the Chinese character wu. This is essentially the thing that is the one thing, that everything is part of the one, right? But what happens is it gets manifest into what's called presence. And we could say with form. And this would be then the 10,000 things that they talk about. But it's still the absence stuff, whatever that is. Presence is just the manifestation of it in a particular way. So not exactly a good example, but you could kind of think about water. And if you like froze it into like a sculpture, it's still water, but it's in a different kind of form and it looks different, right? It looks like a thing. Absence is the stuff that is what everything is, but without form. Presence is that same stuff, but in form, the 10,000 things. And there's this moving back and forth. So it'll talk about things that come into presence and exist for a period of time, and then they return to the source or back to absence. And there's just kind of this flow back and forth that happens within this worldview. And then within that, we've got this concept of yin yang, and that is within that presence, within the 10,000 things. There's this flow between, you know, the yin and the yang that's constantly transforming between the two. And our goal, according to the Taoists, would be we want to figure out how to get in harmony, both with that yin yang process of how things transform within presence, within the 10,000 things, but also within the process of moving from absence to presence and back to absence again. And then also with this idea of the Tao, the overall way of things. So I don't want to misconstrue this in terms of thinking of these as different aspects. It's kind of all still like one thing, just different kinds of ways that we talk about it. So this would be kind of that one, and the self, or that Po spirit or Po soul. How do we recognize everything is part of that presence, that absence, and yet it feels like we're distinct? How do we hold those together without getting to that point of separation or division? A little bit different of a worldview than what we currently have, but there are ways that we can think about this in terms of our current worldview. So if we're going to try and deal with losing that illusion of separation, there's maybe, and I've just kind of identified 4 different tracks here that we could look at, but there could be lots of them. And so when we're thinking about this meditation or this mindfulness, it can be that we take a concept like the Tao, or this idea that there's one thing that is everything, and we sit with that and focus on that concept. and just really try to internalize that in order to bring about more of a sense of unity, so that we kind of have more of a pattern of thinking that I am not individuated, but I'm actually a part of this larger whole, which will then have other implications in terms of how we think about, well, how should I deal with, my neighbor, or with the environment, with all these different pieces that have a very direct impact on the idea of, what if everything actually is all connected? Well, if I've internalized that, then that's going to have a profound effect on my behavior. And so there's that question they start with, can you hold these two things together without separation? So if we're going to think about this in our modern context, we might look at a couple of different ways of reflecting and focusing on the similar idea, but from more of a contemporary scientific perspective. And one of those would be this idea of reductionism. So if we think about what everything is, we can say, okay, well, whether we're talking about, myself or this table here, or the computer and everything that we interact with, we're dealing with essentially atoms, right? Grouped together in different ways that make up things like molecules that grow into larger and larger structures that are ultimately people and mountains and all sorts of stuff. But it's kind of funny to think that all of it, if you break it down, is just atoms. And atoms, yes, there's different elements, but those elements, and by elements, we're just talking about different types of atoms based on what they're made up of, the different parts. But those parts all go back to a smaller level that we call particles. So the number of electrons, the number of neutrons and protons, but the neutrons and protons are actually made up of quarks. So really, the vast majority of everything that we interact with, even though there's, I think it's 17 different particles in the standard model, most everything that we ever interact with is only made up of three things in terms of particles, but then there's also some, well, let me just explain. There's electrons, up quarks and down quarks. And then there's the electromagnetic force that connects them, which would be seen as or experienced as photons, which is electricity, or the electromagnetic field plus light, how we experience that. And then there's the force connecting the protons and neutrons together with the strong and weak nuclear forces. And of course, gravity. So 3 particles, 4 forces makes up everything that we come in contact with. But we can bring that down even further in reduction to the current speculation is that even these particles, these electrons or these quarks, are actually agitations, if you will, within a larger field. And by field, they just mean that there's a point in every place that can be identified. And so within these fields, there's these agitations that make up these particles that come together to make up these ultimately atoms that make up all the molecules that make up everything that we experience. So even from that current modern day scientific perspective, we can still say everything is one thing. It just gets manifest in these different particles that make different atoms, which make different molecules and so forth in different ways, but it's all essentially being made of the same one thing. The other way we could look at this in a modern context is the fact that everything is correlative in terms of existence almost itself. So one of the strange things that's kind of been uncovered when we think about quantum mechanics is that the attributes of things only exist in relationship to other things that happen to be there. So if we think about aspects of ourselves, how tall am I? How strong am I? How fast am I moving? What color am I? All these different attributes that make up what we think of ourselves, none of those make any kind of sense or have any real context except in comparison to something else. So if there was literally nothing else, there's no way to actually describe even who you are. Everything, in a sense, is really dependent on everything else in terms of even having any kind of attributes. which is another kind of interesting meditation that you can get into in terms of how would something, or not how, but the fact that nothing actually exists except in relationship to other things. Everything is correlative. Then we can think about genetic relation. So we definitely talk about, within families, how we have genetic traits that relate us, but we can also see that we have genetic traits that are inherent in all humans. And then we can even see how outside of our human species, we have connections where, many people have heard that 98% of our genetic code is identical to chimpanzees. Okay, clearly there's a relationship there. But did you know there's even, I think it is, the number is 59% of our genetic code is shared with bananas. This is what gets really fascinating, is all life, whether we're talking about plant or animal or, bacteria, all goes back to what they call LUCA, last universal common ancestor, that we all share that. It all started from this one place that spread and developed in all these different ways. So again, we have another very interesting way where we can think about the oneness of everything through how everything is actually related. And then the final thought I had here is that we can think about it from an environmental interdependence. So the idea that I am an individual really gets challenged when we realize that I can't exist without things like food and water and air. And where does food and water and air come from? It all requires that there's planets, that there's animals, that there's, a solar system with the sun at the center of it. And all of that is really dependent on literally everything, going back to the Big Bang. Nothing that exists right now is really possible without that long chain of events that unfolded in the way that it did. And all those pieces are necessary in order for me to even exist. So can I really be seen as separate from that? Maybe I can be removed from it in some way, but then, I can't live without being part of that environment in some way. So there's a whole nother direction that we can take, kind of this view of, myself, that Po spirit or soul is actually part of this oneness, this everything. And how does that change things if I start to see myself as related to this larger whole? So that's quite a bit of stuff. I'm going to pause here and see what kind of thoughts you guys have on these ideas, or if you had questions about those different concepts we just went over. Maybe I'll put us back to, do we have stunned silence, or did everybody fall into a meditative sleep?
I was just going to say, I'm just going to get my camera on so I'm not in a meditative state, but I'm actually paying attention. I just don't have any concrete thoughts on all of this. Like, I'm absorbing it and I'm like, yep, makes all sense. Just no opinions for once in my life, so I'll take it as a win.
Would this be because this is something that you kind of already connected with, or that it just already resonates, or why? How is it that it doesn't stir anything?
It's some of it, yes. Some of it's sort of like, yep, meditation, for example, the mindfulness has been a thing. Others just like, okay, well, that's a concept that I want to think on maybe a little bit later on. I think that just today is Friday and I'm checked out. Could be a lot of things, to be honest. Or there's a mysterious meeting in my calendar that says, "Hey, team update," and I'm afraid that someone will let go again. I don't know.
Anybody else have some thoughts? Does anybody find it challenging to think of everything being one thing, in either like a comforting way or a disturbing way?
I mean, what is the impact to me of that? Right? Like, if yes, What does it mean for me? If no, what does that mean to me? Am I gonna have to? Am I gonna be able to not have to go to work and I can just, go enjoy life? No. Can I? It's just It's a very theoretical concept that I guess just needs to process more if it has any impact to me.
I know from our past conversations, you seem to have some interest in things relating to social justice, if I can phrase it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does that get into your framing of the other, either victim or oppressor, in terms of thinking about everything being one thing?
I don't know. I, I guess if I was to force myself to give an answer, like even if let's say the abuser and a victim are of one, it's still, again, what does it mean to them? What does it mean for those people? It still means that the victim is a victim. It's still being abused. It still means that the abuser is abusing. And I guess, does it come to the actions? Just because we all came from the same dough, and we still took our own different actions, made different choices. Like, my brother and I are from the same family, half at least, and yet I consider him completely toxic, and I don't have anything to do with you. My sister, who can half sister, I consider her as a close family, but I haven't talked to her for 15 years because she's just out of my reach because of my father. Like, it's just because we're one, okay, but it's just like, I'm struggling to find the consequential impacts of that, either the realization or acceptance of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a very fair point and an important point that we'll see as we unfold more in the Tao Te Ching. There's different concepts where this is going to come up, especially when we think of, how we interact with other people. I think for myself anyway, where I find this coming into play is, and maybe it's because it's pulling in some additional concepts that kind of go with this idea of oneness, right? That part of, especially from the modern scientific perspective of how we understand oneness, is that there's this process that unfolds according to these predictable patterns, or what we call laws of physics or laws of nature, that would be equivalent to, I think, what they're talking about when they talk about Tao. But the consequence of that is everything unfolds in the only way it could unfold. And that means it gets into a whole nother category of how we think about the issue of responsibility. And responsibility then has a lot to do with how we view the concept of both oppressor and victim. That I don't want to say it eliminates that process. I think there's still that concepts that we need to deal with, but it expands it beyond the individuals that are involved. And I think the place that I see the biggest shift for me is when I'm thinking about, failed relationships of one kind or another, whether it's, serious failures like murder and other kinds of mayhem, or just general things like, I don't get along with my brother or sister, that these things are beyond just the individuals involved, that we have to think about these larger structures and how they play into this process. The other piece that I think it has to do with connection is in this idea of compassion, because it becomes very hard for us to have compassion when we view the other as being wholly responsible for what they do. When we start to see the other as, in a sense, kind of a product of a long chain of things that goes even beyond anything they had any control over. Same with ourselves, right? It allows us to have self-compassion in a way that maybe is difficult when we start to see this whole causal chain that connects everything. Then it doesn't take away the problem that we've got these different social issues that we have to deal with, but I think it changes how we evaluate what that problem is and what the solution might be that we want to move towards. And for me, I would say the biggest shift with all this has been the immense depth of compassion that is now possible for even people that I would never have thought that that was possible to have compassion for. But there's a lot of, moving pieces. And of course, there's a lot of what ifs or what abouts that people will bring up, what about this, that, and the other thing to fit this together, right? We can't answer it all at once, but at the core behind how I get to that place is this deep reflection on the fact that everything is one thing, that I am a part of this whole. And ultimately, in a very literal sense, it feels like the world revolves around me because I'm the point of my experience and everything is happening outside of me or around me, right? So it can be very easy to get caught into, and I don't mean this in like the most negative way we talk about self-centeredness, but it's our basic frame of perception is from self-centeredness because everything goes out from self. So really focusing on the fact that I am just implanted in this bigger piece, right? And my purpose, if you will, in that larger structure takes its form from its place in that. And those things work together in a way to shape that awareness and that compassion that would be very difficult to do if it wasn't based on how I'm understanding this idea of everything is actually one thing. I know that might sound a little vague, but
yeah, I find the concept kind of useful from a Christian perspective, where we pray for both oppressors and the oppressed, because the reality is that both are very much damaged by what happens to them. There's damage in both cases, profound damage. And
Sure.
then I even would tie my whole military background, where we speak of moral injury, things that people do in a combat situation that results in moral injury to themselves, that they carry out of the combat zone with them often for the rest of their lives.
For sure. Yeah.
As you speak to that, I think this is the reason why I'm here, to get different tools, different perspective, different methods of how to deal with the world and within myself, and not necessarily. Well, maybe it's comparable to finding, solace and other tools in religion or any other spirituality. In exactly as you said, just find ways to move on, find ways to get to the next step. As again, relating it back to my broken personal life, and when I first moved to Canada, and I decided I'm going to stay here, my mother took it very poorly, and we had a massive fallout. And it took me the longest time to stop feeling guilty. It took me to therapy to understand or get my tools to process that myself, and to find that this is her choice or how she's reacting to that, not mine. And finding, again, just different tools to get myself to the next step. And I can imagine that we see that a lot of in the news when there is a murder victim of another failed relationship, when the family of the victim are forgiving the murderer or the abuser or whatnot, and they find this, they use it as a tool for themselves to move on, to not suffer, to alleviate their own pain. So all what you were talking about, Jim, is absolutely that clicked very well with me, in terms of this is a tool for me to use to move on, or to handle as the life comes at me.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of it, is it all comes down to perception, right? Ultimately, everything is, in a sense, kind of in our head, because we are interpreting everything that happens in a certain light, which impacts how we then feel about it and our experience of life. So the different perspectives, like you're saying, that we get exposed to help us to have different tools potentially for how do we address and become more resilient, hopefully, to the different things that can confront us as we go through life. The one thing I might also point out too is, and I don't think this is the way you meant it, but the idea of getting on or going on doesn't mean that we're saying that things didn't matter, right? We're still just finding different ways of how we address it that are maybe more healthful in terms of ourselves and others, how we're dealing with those issues, as opposed to more destructive ways.
What we call it, managing our reactions, even if it's post reaction, there's always impact, right? And it changes over time, and our reaction to those changes or reaction to those reactions just change over time. So it's okay to have different tools and different reactions to your previous reactions.
Yes. And isn't it funny how we look back over time at the way we responded to things at a certain point in our life versus how we do now? And it's interesting to see that constant growth and change.
Well, now we have a record of it thanks to social media. I can go back to 2007 and see what I posted on Facebook and be like, oh my God.
Yeah, that's a whole nother dynamic that's really interesting. Well, we've got a few minutes left. Anybody else have some thoughts they'd like to share or questions to bring up?
I think the concept of forgiveness is, I don't think quite ties into the actual topic that we're discussing today, but Martin kind of like sort of triggered something in my brain just around the concept of forgiveness. And I actually think it's Ted Lasso that started me thinking this, just talking about how forgiveness isn't for the person that did you wrong. Forgiveness is for yourself. It is like they can continue to do their thing and have their choices and live their life and be the person that they choose to be. The forgiveness is for you to let go of that negative, feelings and hurt, and just be like, I'm free of it, because they even though we're connected, they are free to make their own choices and free to do all of that, and I can choose not to be impacted by that anymore. So and I'm pretty sure it was the last Ted Lasso episode that touched on that.
Yeah, I think I just watched that last night, actually.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, there's an aspect of forgiveness that the person who did the offending has to receive or has to accept. And the very fact of accepting that forgiveness implies that there was a wrong that needed to be forgiven. So sometimes we can think of forgiving as meaning it didn't matter, or it's no big deal, or we're just kind of brushing past it. But the very act of forgiving means that there was something that there was this infringement, there was this problem. So it's important to note that forgiveness does not mean dismissing. Yeah, that's a good one. Forgiveness is a really interesting topic to explore, because it can feel so much like I'm owed, my pound of flesh, and you're asking me to let go of it. And that's really kind of is ultimately like, maybe there is a legitimate case to be made in some sense that something's owed to you, but you're choosing to forego it. Not to say to dismiss it, but to forego it for some other greater cause or some other reason that makes more helpful sense.
And not to say that it's acceptable.
Yeah, it doesn't mean
exactly
excuse the behavior. Yeah. Yeah. Well, any other thoughts then before we close?
Jim, I don't know if we got that far in the chapter, but I did find that intriguing, that distinction that was drawn between earth and heaven. Are we going to explore that at some point?
Yes, and we'll have to continue through this one. We couldn't get through it all today because there's a lot of material to cover. But yeah, we'll definitely come back to that one.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And I guess this will be the time that we can wrap this up. Just want to let everybody know, if you'd like to join us in our Friday morning discussions on Zoom, you can register at www.kinship.cafe, and we would love to see you here. So thank you all for joining, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.